The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his protection officer. It was a Tuesday in early autumn, and the young prince had requested to visit the memorial garden where flowers were still being laid for his late great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. The request had surprised many at the palace, as George rarely asked to make such personal visits. As they approached the garden, George noticed an elderly man in a worn military uniform standing perfectly still before the memorial wall. The man's weathered hands trembled slightly as he held a single white rose, and tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. Something about the scene made George pause in his steps, causing his protection officer to look down at him with concern. The elderly gentleman was Thomas Mitchell, a 94-year-old veteran who had served in the Queen's Guard for over 30 years during his younger days. He had traveled from his small flat in London, using his pension money to buy a train ticket just to pay his respects one more time. Thomas had served during some of the most important moments of the Queen's reign, standing guard during state visits, royal weddings, and historic ceremonies. George watched quietly as Thomas struggled to place his rose among the thousands of other flowers. The old man's arthritis made it difficult for him to bend down, and he winced with each movement. Several tourists nearby seemed annoyed by how long he was taking, some even checking their phones impatiently. But George saw something different. He saw a man whose entire life had been dedicated to serving his family, now struggling to say goodbye to the monarch he had protected and loved. Without saying a word to his protection officer, George stepped forward. The movement was so natural and gentle that it caught everyone nearby off guard. Thomas looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized the young prince. For a moment, panic crossed his face, worried that he might be in the way or causing some kind of disruption to royal protocol. George simply smiled and extended his small hands toward the white rose. Thomas hesitated, unsure of what the prince intended. The boy's eyes were kind and understanding, showing a maturity that seemed far beyond his 10 years. Around them, the usual bustle of the memorial garden had grown quiet as people began to notice what was happening. The protection officer started to step forward, but something in George's demeanor made him pause. This wasn't a security concern or a breach of protocol. This was a moment of pure human connection, and even the trained guard recognized that interfering would be wrong. Instead, he positioned himself discreetly nearby, allowing the scene to unfold naturally. Thomas slowly handed the rose to Prince George, his hands shaking not just from age but from the emotion of the moment. George accepted the flower with the same reverence that Thomas had shown, treating it like the precious tribute it was. The old veteran attempted to bow, but his knees betrayed him and he nearly lost his balance. George quickly reached out to steady Thomas, his small hand supporting the elderly man's elbow. The gesture was instinctive and caring, showing none of the hesitation that might be expected from a child in such a formal setting. Thomas looked into George's eyes and saw something that reminded him powerfully of the Queen herself. That same sense of duty, compassion, and understanding that had made her so beloved. Without speaking, George helped Thomas to a nearby bench. The old man's breathing was labored, and it was clear that the emotional weight of the visit combined with his physical limitations had taken a toll on him. George sat beside him, still holding the white rose, waiting patiently for Thomas to catch his breath. Other visitors to the memorial had now stopped what they were doing. Sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary, phones were quietly put away, and conversations hushed as people recognized the solemnity of the moment. Even the usually bustling palace guards had taken notice, though they maintained their professional composure while keeping a respectful distance. Thomas finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He told George about his years of service, about standing guard during the Queen's coronation anniversary celebrations, and about how serving the royal family had been the greatest honor of his life. George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed he truly understood the significance of Thomas's sacrifice and dedication. The conversation revealed something remarkable about both individuals. Thomas spoke not of glory or recognition, but of duty and love for country. George, despite his youth, seemed to grasp the weight of what it meant to dedicate one's life to service. The connection between them transcended age, creating a bridge between the old guard and the future of the monarchy. As Thomas shared his stories, George noticed the old man kept touching a small medal pinned to his jacket. It was tarnished with age, but clearly precious to him. When George asked about it, Thomas's eyes lit up with pride. He explained that it was a long service and good conduct medal, awarded to him personally by Queen Elizabeth II in 1987 for his 25 years of faithful service. Thomas described that day with vivid detail, how nervous he had been standing before the Queen, how she had looked directly into his eyes as she pinned the medal to his uniform, and how she had thanked him personally for his dedication. He had carried that moment with him for over 35 years, and it had sustained him through difficult times, illness, and the loneliness that came with age. George listened with fascination as Thomas described the daily routine of a palace guard. The early morning preparations, the hours of standing perfectly still regardless of weather, the pride that came with protecting something greater than oneself. Thomas spoke of ceremonial duties during state visits, how he had stood guard while world leaders met with the Queen, always vigilant, always ready to serve. The old veteran also shared more personal moments, times when the Queen had quietly acknowledged the guard's service with a small nod or smile, how she had once delayed her schedule to allow a guard who had fainted in the heat to receive medical attention, and how she had always shown consideration for those who served her. These stories painted a picture of a monarch who truly understood and appreciated the human cost of service. As they sat together, George made a decision that surprised even himself. He stood up and carefully walked to the memorial wall, still carrying Thomas's white rose. The garden had grown even quieter, with dozens of visitors now watching the young prince's every move. George knelt down and placed the rose in the exact spot where Thomas had been struggling to put it. But he did something more. He remained kneeling for a full minute, his head bowed in silent prayer or reflection. This wasn't a quick gesture for the cameras or a hurried royal duty. It was a genuine moment of respect, both for his great-grandmother and for the man who had served her so faithfully. When he stood up, there wasn't a dry eye among the onlookers. George returned to Thomas, who was now openly weeping. The old man tried to stand to show proper respect, but George gently placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, encouraging him to remain seated. This small gesture spoke volumes about the kind of leader George might become, one who understood that true respect flows in both directions. The prince then did something that no one expected. He carefully unpinned a small commemorative pin from his own jacket, a special piece that had been given to him by his father for the memorial service. Without hesitation, he offered it to Thomas. The old veteran protested, saying he couldn't possibly accept something so precious from a prince, but George insisted with a maturity that belied his years. Thomas accepted the pin with shaking hands, understanding that this was more than just a gift. It was recognition of his service, a bridge between generations of dedication to the crown, and a promise that his years of faithful service would not be forgotten. The exchange represented something profound about continuity, respect, and the bonds that tie people together across social divides. Word of what was happening began to spread among the palace staff. Senior officials started arriving at the garden, initially concerned about protocol but quickly recognizing that this was a moment that transcended normal procedures. Even hardened palace guards found themselves moved by the interaction between the young prince and the elderly veteran. The protection officer, who had initially been concerned about the unscripted nature of the encounter, now realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't a security breach or a deviation from protocol. This was the future of the monarchy, showing the kind of character that would serve the nation well in years to come. As news of the encounter began to spread beyond the memorial garden, palace staff faced an interesting dilemma. How should they handle a story that showed such genuine emotion and human connection? Some worried about privacy, others about setting precedents, but most recognized that this was the kind of story that reminded people why the monarchy mattered in modern Britain. Thomas and George continued their conversation, now joined by a few other veterans who had been visiting the memorial. George listened to each of their stories with the same attention and respect he had shown Thomas, asking questions that demonstrated his genuine interest in their service and sacrifice. It became clear that this wasn't just a chance encounter, but a meaningful exchange between different generations of those who serve. The gathering had grown to include several other veterans who had come to pay their respects. Each man had his own story of service, his own memories of the Queen and his own struggles with age and the changing world around them. George moved among them like a natural diplomat, giving each person his full attention and showing genuine interest in their experiences. One veteran, Harold Webb, had served during the Queen's Silver Jubilee celebrations in 1977. He told George about the massive crowds, the security challenges, and the pride he felt watching the Queen navigate it all with such grace and dignity. Another, James Patterson, had been on duty during Prince William and Catherine's wedding, describing the excitement and the overwhelming sense of responsibility he felt, knowing the world was watching. As George listened to these stories, something remarkable became apparent to the watching palace staff. The young prince wasn't just being polite or fulfilling a duty. He was genuinely absorbing lessons about service, sacrifice, and leadership from these men who had lived it. Each conversation was adding to his understanding of what it truly meant to serve others and to put duty before personal comfort. Thomas, meanwhile, had been quietly observing George's interactions with the other veterans. What struck him most was how the prince treated each man as an individual, remembering details from earlier conversations and asking follow-up questions that showed he had been truly listening. This level of attention and respect was something Thomas had seen in very few people. Regardless of their age or position, the memorial garden had become an impromptu gathering place for these veterans, many of whom had traveled long distances and spent their limited resources to be there. George began to understand that for these men, this wasn't just a visit to a memorial. It was a pilgrimage, a final opportunity to show their respect and say goodbye to the monarch who had defined their lives and given meaning to their service. One of the most touching moments came when Thomas showed George a photograph he carried in his wallet. It was faded and worn from decades of handling, showing Thomas as a young guardsman standing at attention during one of the Queen's early public appearances. In the photo, he looked proud, strong, and ready to face any challenge in service of his country and his Queen. George studied the photograph carefully, then looked at Thomas as he was now, frail, emotional, but still carrying that same pride and dedication. The prince seemed to understand something profound about the passage of time and the consistency of character. Thomas had aged, his body had weakened, but his heart and his commitment remained unchanged. The protection officer had been in contact with senior palace officials throughout this encounter. What had started as a brief visit to the memorial had become something much more significant. Decisions were being made at the highest levels about how to handle this situation, but the consensus was clear. George's instincts were right, and this moment should be allowed to continue naturally. News photographers had begun to gather at the edges of the garden, but they were being kept at a respectful distance by palace security. The officials recognized that while this was a private moment of personal connection, it was also something that the public should eventually know about. The challenge was balancing respect for the privacy of the veterans with the public's right to see this side of their future king. George continued his conversations with the veterans, but he also began to notice other visitors to the memorial. He saw families with children, elderly couples supporting each other as they laid flowers, and individuals standing alone with their memories. The prince began to understand that grief and remembrance took many forms, and that his great-grandmother had touched lives in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The afternoon was wearing on, and George's scheduled return to his other duties was approaching. However, the prince seemed reluctant to leave, sensing that these moments were important not just for the veterans but for his own understanding of what it meant to be royal. His protection officer faced a delicate balance between maintaining the schedule and allowing this meaningful encounter to reach its natural conclusion. Thomas had been watching George throughout the afternoon, and he could see qualities in the young prince that gave him hope for the future. Here was a child who could have been anywhere, doing anything that children his age enjoyed, but who had chosen to spend his time listening to old men tell their stories. More importantly, he was doing it with sincerity and genuine interest, not as a burden or obligation. The other veterans had also been impressed by George's demeanor and attention. They began to share among themselves how different this was from their usual experiences with younger generations. Too often they felt invisible or dismissed, their stories unheard and their service forgotten. George had shown them that their experiences mattered, and that their dedication was still valued and respected. As the day progressed, George noticed that Thomas was becoming increasingly tired. The emotional weight of the visit, combined with his age and physical limitations, was clearly taking its toll. The old veteran had been standing and sitting repeatedly, trying to maintain proper posture out of respect for the prince, but his body was betraying his determination. Without being asked, George suggested that Thomas sit down and rest for as long as he needed. The prince then did something that shocked everyone present. He sat down on the ground next to Thomas's bench, looking up at the elderly man with complete attention. This gesture eliminated any sense of hierarchy or protocol, creating a moment of pure human connection that transcended social positions. Thomas was initially uncomfortable with a prince sitting on the ground for his benefit, but George's easy manner and genuine smile put him at ease. The prince explained that he often sat on the ground when talking with his younger siblings, and that he found it easier to really listen when he wasn't worried about formal positioning. This simple explanation revealed George's natural wisdom and his understanding that communication was more important than ceremony. From his position on the ground, George asked Thomas about his life beyond his military service. He learned that Thomas had been married for 68 years to his beloved wife Margaret, who had passed away just 6 months before the Queen. This revelation explained much about Thomas's emotional state and his need to make this pilgrimage. He was grieving not just for his queen but for his life partner, and finding connections between these losses. Thomas described how Margaret had shared his pride in his royal service, how she had carefully maintained his uniforms and medals, and how she had insisted on watching every royal event on television, pointing out when she could spot Thomas among the guards. She had been his biggest supporter and his connection to civilian life, helping him navigate the challenges of transitioning from military to regular employment after his guard service ended. The conversation revealed that Thomas had no close family left. His only son had died in a car accident 20 years ago, and he had no grandchildren. Margaret had been his world, and without her he felt disconnected from everything except his memories of service. This pilgrimage to the memorial was his way of finding meaning and connection in a life that had become very lonely. George listened to this story with remarkable composure for a child his age, showing empathy and understanding that impressed all the adults watching. He began to realize that service and sacrifice extended far beyond the formal duties Thomas had performed as a guard. The real sacrifice was the lifetime of putting others' needs first, even when it meant personal loss and loneliness. The prince then shared something unexpected with Thomas. He talked about missing his great-grandmother, about the special conversations they had shared, and about trying to understand what it meant to carry on her legacy. George's openness and vulnerability created a safe space for Thomas to express his own grief and uncertainty about the future. This exchange between a 10-year-old prince and a 94-year-old veteran became something extraordinary. Two people from completely different backgrounds and life stages found common ground in their shared sense of loss and their commitment to honoring the Queen's memory. Their conversation demonstrated that grief and respect know no boundaries of age or social position. Other visitors to the memorial had begun to recognize what was happening and started giving the pair more space, intuitively understanding that they were witnessing something special. The usual tourist chatter had quieted to respectful whispers, and many people found themselves moved by the obvious connection between the young prince and the elderly veteran. Palace officials who had arrived to observe the situation found themselves reconsidering their usual protocols. This wasn't a photo opportunity or a planned engagement. This was genuine human interaction that was teaching the future king valuable lessons about service, sacrifice, and the real meaning of leadership. They recognized that interrupting this moment would be both wrong and counterproductive. The protection officer had positioned himself where he could ensure security while remaining unobtrusive. He had served in various capacities for years, but he was witnessing something that would stay with him for the rest of his career. The natural grace and instinctive compassion George was showing convinced him that the monarchy would be in good hands when the time came. As afternoon moved toward evening, Thomas began to worry that he was keeping the prince from important duties. He started to apologize and suggest that George should leave, but the prince gently deflected these concerns. George had apparently decided that this was exactly where he needed to be, and that these conversations were among the most important he had ever had. The memorial garden was beginning to empty as other visitors completed their tributes and left, but the core group of veterans remained. They had formed an informal circle around George and Thomas, each contributing to conversations that ranged from specific memories of royal service to broader discussions about duty, honor, and the meaning of a life spent in service to others. As the golden hour approached, George made an observation that surprised everyone present. He noticed that each veteran had placed their tributes in different areas of the memorial, seemingly at random. When he asked about this, he discovered that each man had chosen spots that corresponded to specific memories or moments from their service. The memorial wasn't just a wall to them, it was a map of their personal history with the Queen. Thomas explained that he had chosen his spot because it was near a plaque commemorating the Queen's Silver Jubilee, the period when he had served most actively. Harold had placed his flowers near information about the Queen's role as Colonel-in-Chief of various regiments, reflecting his military pride. Each location was deeply personal and meaningful, turning the memorial into a collection of individual stories rather than just a formal tribute. This revelation led George to ask each veteran to show him their chosen spots and explain their significance. What followed was an impromptu tour of the memorial, with each elderly man sharing intimate details about specific moments in their service. George listened intently to each story, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated his growing understanding of how personal history interweaves with national service. The exercise revealed something profound about memory and meaning. These men didn't just remember serving the Queen, they remembered specific days, specific moments, specific feelings that had shaped their understanding of duty and purpose. George began to understand that royal service wasn't an abstract concept, but a collection of human moments, individual choices, and personal sacrifices that added up to something greater than their parts. During this walking tour, Thomas began to struggle physically. His arthritis was worsening in the cooling air, and his emotional exhaustion was becoming more apparent. George immediately noticed his difficulty and, without hesitation, offered his arm for support. The sight of a young prince helping an elderly veteran navigate the memorial created one of the most powerful images of the entire encounter. As they walked together, Thomas shared one of his most treasured memories. During a particularly difficult period in his life, when his son had been seriously ill, the Queen had somehow learned of his situation. She had arranged for him to have additional leave to care for his family, but more importantly, she had sent a personal note expressing her concern and support. Thomas still carried that note in his wallet, next to the faded photograph of his younger self. George asked to see the note, and Thomas carefully unfolded the delicate paper. The Queen's handwriting was elegant and personal, expressing genuine care for Thomas's family situation and appreciation for his continued dedication despite his personal challenges. George read the note silently, and when he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. He was beginning to understand the depth of his great-grandmother, his character, and the personal attention she gave to those who served her. This moment created a powerful connection between George and Thomas that transcended their age difference and social positions. Both were mourning the same person, but from completely different perspectives. George had lost a beloved great-grandmother who had guided and influenced his young life. Thomas had lost the monarch who had given meaning and purpose to his entire adult existence. The other veterans had been watching this exchange with growing emotion. They each had similar stories of the Queen's personal attention and care, moments when she had gone beyond her formal duties to show genuine concern for their welfare. These stories painted a picture of a monarch who understood that leadership meant caring for the individuals who made service possible. As the evening approached, palace officials began to gently suggest that it might be time for George to return to his other responsibilities. However, the prince had one more request. He asked if Thomas and the other veterans would be willing to walk with him to another part of the castle grounds, where there was a smaller, more private memorial that few visitors knew about. The group slowly made their way across the grounds, with George helping to support Thomas and ensuring that all the veterans could keep up with the pace. The smaller memorial was indeed more intimate, featuring a simple stone bench and a single tree planted in the Queen's memory. George had apparently visited this spot before, and wanted to share it with men who would truly appreciate its significance. At the private memorial, George asked each veteran to share one final memory or thought about the Queen. What followed was a deeply moving series of testimonials that revealed the human side of royal service. Each man spoke not of grand ceremonies or historic moments, but of small kindnesses, personal interactions, and the way the Queen had made them feel valued and important. Thomas spoke last, describing how the Queen had shaped not just his career, but his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. He talked about the values she had demonstrated: consistency, dedication, genuine care for others, and the ability to put duty above personal comfort. He expressed hope that these values would continue in the royal family and in the nation she had served so faithfully. George listened to each testimonial with the respect and attention they deserved. When the veterans finished speaking, he surprised them all by sharing his own thoughts about his great-grandmother. Speaking with remarkable maturity, he talked about learning from her example, about understanding that being royal meant serving others, and about his determination to honor her memory through his own future service. As the sun began to set over Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the private memorial, George made a decision that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. He asked his protection officer for permission to make a phone call, and after a brief conversation, arrangements were made for each veteran to receive transportation back to their homes, ensuring they wouldn't have to struggle with public transport after such an emotional day. The veterans were overwhelmed by this thoughtfulness, but George wasn't finished. He had noticed that several of the men seemed frail and potentially isolated, and he was concerned about their welfare beyond this single day. Through his protection officer, he arranged for palace staff to gather contact information, ostensibly for sending thank-you notes, but really to ensure that someone would check on these elderly men who had given so much of their lives in service. Thomas, in particular, had captured George's attention and concern. The old veteran's isolation and grief were apparent, and George seemed determined to ensure that Thomas's sacrifice and service wouldn't be forgotten. The prince asked if Thomas would be willing to receive correspondence from the palace, explaining that he would like to continue learning about the history Thomas had lived through and witnessed. The offer left Thomas speechless. The idea that a member of the royal family would want to maintain contact with an elderly retired guard seemed beyond his imagination. But George's sincerity was unmistakable, and Thomas accepted the offer with deep gratitude. The prince promised that these wouldn't be formal, official communications, but personal letters where Thomas could share memories and George could continue learning from his experiences. As preparations were made for the veterans' departures, word of the afternoon's events had spread throughout the palace. Senior staff members who had initially been concerned about protocol breaches were now recognizing that George had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and character that the monarchy needed. His instinctive understanding of how to honor service while showing genuine human compassion impressed even the most experienced royal advisors. The protection officer, who had witnessed the entire encounter, found himself profoundly moved by what he had seen. In his years of service, he had protected various members of the royal family in many different situations, but he had never seen such natural grace and intuitive understanding of what leadership really meant. George's actions throughout the day had shown wisdom far beyond his years. Each veteran took his leave personally from George, and each exchange was meaningful in its own way. Harold thanked the prince for listening to his stories and for making him feel that his service had mattered. James expressed amazement at George's maturity and his genuine interest in their experiences. But the most emotional farewell was between George and Thomas. As Thomas prepared to leave, he tried once more to return the commemorative pin that George had given him earlier. The old veteran felt that he didn't deserve such a precious gift from a member of the royal family, but George gently refused to take it back, explaining that Thomas had earned it through decades of faithful service, and that it rightfully belonged to him. The pin would serve as a connection between them and a reminder that service is honored across generations. Thomas then did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He slowly removed his long service and good conduct medal from his jacket and offered it to George. The medal represented 30 years of dedicated service and was his most precious possession, but he wanted the prince to have something that represented the commitment and values they had. Discussed throughout the day, George was clearly moved by the offer but gently declined to accept such a precious personal item. Instead, He asked if Thomas would be willing to loan the medal to the palace for a special display honoring the guards who had served the Queen throughout her reign. This suggestion allowed Thomas to share his treasure while keeping ownership of something so meaningful to his identity and history. The arrangement satisfied everyone involved. Thomas would be recognized as a contributor to royal history, his medal would be properly displayed and honored, and George would have a tangible connection to the stories and experiences that had made such an impression on him. It was a solution that showed George's developing diplomatic skills and his understanding of how to honor people while respecting their dignity. As the cars arranged by the palace arrived to transport the veterans home, each man expressed his gratitude not just for the transportation, but for the entire experience. They had come to the memorial feeling isolated and forgotten, carrying grief and memories that seemed to matter to no one. They were leaving feeling valued, heard, and connected to something larger than themselves. The protection officer coordinated the departures, ensuring that each veteran was safely settled and that their addresses were properly recorded for follow-up contact. He had received specific instructions from George to make sure that palace staff would check on these men periodically, particularly Thomas, whose isolation and recent losses made him potentially vulnerable. As the last car disappeared into the evening, George stood quietly at the private memorial, reflecting on the day's events. His protection officer approached carefully, unsure whether to interrupt the prince's thoughts. George looked up with a smile and thanked him for allowing the day to unfold naturally, recognizing that strict adherence to protocol would have prevented something meaningful from happening. In the weeks that followed, the impact of that afternoon at the memorial continued to ripple through both the palace and the lives of the veterans who had been present. George had kept his promise to write to Thomas, and their correspondence had become a source of joy and purpose for the elderly veteran. The letters weren't formal royal communications, but genuine exchanges between two people who had found common ground in their respect for service and their shared grief. Thomas's first letter to George had been carefully handwritten, sharing more detailed memories of his service and expressing his continued amazement at the prince's kindness and maturity. George's response had been equally personal, asking specific questions about royal protocol, historical events Thomas had witnessed, and the daily life of a palace guard. The correspondence had become a bridge between past and future, connecting lived history with coming responsibility. Palace staff had indeed followed through on checking on the veterans, and what they discovered reinforced George's instincts about the importance of the encounter. Several of the men, including Thomas, had been struggling with isolation and depression following the Queen's death. The afternoon at the memorial and the subsequent attention from the palace had provided them with renewed purpose and connection to something larger than their individual grief. Thomas, in particular, had experienced a remarkable transformation. The loneliness that had overwhelmed him since Margaret's death had been replaced by a sense of mission, sharing his memories and experiences with someone who valued them. He had begun organizing his photographs and documents from his years of service, creating a detailed record that he planned to share with George and eventually donate to the royal archives. The protection officer who had witnessed the original encounter had written a detailed report for his superiors, emphasizing George's natural leadership qualities and his intuitive understanding of what it meant to serve others. The report had been circulated among senior palace staff and had contributed to discussions about George's future training and preparation for his eventual role. Word of George's gesture had also spread among other veterans and former palace staff. Letters began arriving at the palace from men and women who had served the Queen in various capacities, sharing their own stories and expressing gratitude that their service was still remembered and valued. The palace found itself managing an unexpected but welcome correspondence that connected current royals with the people who had made their service possible. George's parents, Prince William and Catherine, had been deeply moved when they learned the full details of what had happened at the memorial. They recognized that their son had demonstrated exactly the kind of character and values they had hoped to instill in him. More importantly, they saw that George was developing his own understanding of royal responsibility, guided by empathy and genuine care for others. The story had eventually reached the media, though palace officials had worked carefully to ensure that it was reported with appropriate sensitivity and respect for the veterans' privacy. The coverage had been overwhelmingly positive, with many commentators noting that George's actions showed promise for the future of the monarchy and its continued relevance in modern Britain. For Thomas, the most meaningful outcome had been the establishment of a small but important tradition. George had arranged for the veterans who had been present that day to be invited to special remembrance services at the palace, ensuring that their service would be formally recognized and their stories preserved. Thomas had been asked to serve as an unofficial advisor on veteran affairs, giving him a new purpose and a continued connection to royal service. The commemoration pin that George had given Thomas had become a treasured possession, but more than that, it had become a symbol of the connection between generations of service. Thomas wore it proudly during his subsequent visits to the palace, and it served as a conversation starter that allowed him to share George's kindness with others who needed to hear that their service mattered. The memorial garden itself had been subtly enhanced following the encounter. A small plaque had been added, recognizing the service of all guards and staff who had served the crown throughout the Queen's reign. While it didn't specifically mention the afternoon's events, those who knew the story understood its significance as a permanent reminder of the human connections that make royal service meaningful. George's understanding of his future role had been profoundly shaped by his conversations with Thomas and the other veterans. The prince had gained insight into the real cost of service, not just the formal duties and ceremonies, but the personal sacrifices, the loneliness, and the lifelong commitment that true service requires. This knowledge would inform his approach to leadership for years to come. The lasting impact of that autumn afternoon extended beyond any single relationship or gesture. George had learned that leadership meant seeing and valuing the individuals who make service possible. Thomas and his fellow veterans had been reminded that their sacrifice and dedication were remembered and honored. And everyone who witnessed the encounter had seen a demonstration of how genuine human connection can transcend social boundaries and create meaning that lasts far beyond any single moment. As winter approached and the first anniversary of the Queen's death drew near, plans were already being made for Thomas and the other veterans to return to the memorial. This time, however, they wouldn't be alone with their grief and memories. They would be accompanied by a young prince who had learned from their stories and who carried their experiences forward into a future where service, sacrifice, and genuine care for others would continue to define what it means to lead with honor.